Thank you, Minister. Question 2 in the names of Deputies Brune and Daly, and you're sharing your time 2 minutes each. Environmental impact of the existing runway and the new proposed runway at Dublin Airport. Deputy Brune.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. Minister, the strategic growth of Dublin Airport, of course, has been phenomenal, and it's a hugely important contributor to Ireland's economy, with making circa 6.9 billion, according to Intervista's study recently, and employing almost 16,000 people directly. And the number of passengers, of course, using the airport reached 25 million in 2015. In the first 5 months of 2016, these numbers have increased by 14% in a year-on-year comparison. Mr. Kevin Toland, the CEO of DAA, whom I met at his briefing last week in Buswell, stated that the development of the new North Runway will support around 1,200 extra jobs, and ultimately it will create another 30,000 jobs. Now, while this further growth and economic impact of Dublin Airport is strongly welcomed, it's imperative that we don't lose sight of the responsibilities of the DAA, Dublin Airport Authority, to the residents and localities surrounding the airport impacted by noise pollution, and of course to the environment itself. Over the years, I've made representations to DAA in relation to early takeoff, very early takeoff, high noise levels over Clonshock, Coolock and Artane, generally when the wind is coming from the east. Recently I've made a number of representations again to Chief Executive Toland and his staff on behalf of residents from the Uffington area, the Howth Peninsula and Sutton, due to their complaints about takeoffs from 4:55 a.m. And in the late 1980s, the 10-hour 28L runway was built without any planning conditions, no environmental impact study, no night flight restrictions, etc. And at the time, the St Margaret's Community Council battled against Aer Lingus for appropriate insulation against noise pollution for the homes affected. The insulation scheme, which was implemented at the time, is apparently the one now being offered to those affected by the North Runway without any review of whether it's still an appropriate level of insulation. And can you confirm this, Minister? What research has DAA carried out to show that this is the proper level of insulation? The new North Runway is now not expected to have night flights, though the DAA are saying they're going to fight that planning permission or condition, meaning that the old 10-hour 28L runway will have the night flights. My residents affected, whom I represent, they absolutely recognise, Minister, the importance of the growth of the airport, particularly in the light of Brexit, but they're simply asking to be treated fairly and with great consideration, the same treatment as those affected by the new North Runway, given that the international legislative environment was very different 25 years ago.
Deputy Daly.
Corlin, Minister, I think that there are two issues here, both of them connected. The first is the old runway at Dublin Airport, where residents within the contours of the old runway are concerned about increased flights, emissions and traffic will compound the problems that they already experience. And as Deputy Brune said, they do feel a little bit hard done by maybe that in the original runway wasn't subjected to the same planning conditions or environmental impact study requirements. So they're kind of worried that the mitigation measures that will be available to those coming within the contours of the new runway may be superior to the protection that they get or don't get, as the case may be. There's a second issue then which I think is of critical importance, and that is the new runway itself. And we have to register that this application is being made now, almost 10 years after the permission was given, in a completely different type of world that we live in now. But even then, with sort of lesser criteria than we have now in terms of noise and environmental protection, the condition was put on that the DAA should not be imposing and loosening up on its restrictions in night flights. Now, anybody who went to the briefing last week and the briefings over, they are explicit in their intention to break that condition that was put on years ago when conditions were less stringent than they are now, and that is completely unacceptable to the local communities in the area. I think there is an enormous issue that the current proposal is to insulate homes that would experience noise levels of 63 decibels or above, but night noise levels of 40 to 55 decibels are known to have adverse health effects according to the World Health Organization. And it's a little bit annoying that the WHO changed its recommendation in terms of night noise maximums in 2009, 2 years after the planning permission was granted, at a level of 63 decibels. So we can't have that. With the knowledge that we know now, we can't ignore the health and safety impacts on residents in that community. So I suppose what we're asking, Minister, is what can you do to reassure us that all of those things will be considered?
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'd like to thank the two deputies for once again bringing this particular subject to my attention. I met the DAA last week on the same day as, in fact, they were doing the presentation of Brussels, and some of those points I put to them to take away. As the deputies will be aware, DAA has a statutory responsibility to manage, operate and develop Dublin Airport, including the provision of infrastructure necessary to meet existing and future demand, such as the North Runway project. DAA was granted planning permission in 2007 for a second parallel runway, and the necessary lands have been preserved for such a project since the 1960s. However, due to the downturn in the economy, the project was not progressed. Given the significant increase in passenger numbers at Dublin Airport in recent years, and the projected traffic growth in future years, it is clear that a second parallel runway is needed. Against this background, DAA announced their decision to proceed with the development of the North Runway project in April 2016. DAA expects construction to commence in early 2017, with the runway operational by 2020. The planning permission granted for the second parallel runway in 2007 had 31 conditions attached and is valid for 10 years. I should point out that planning matters are the responsibility of the relevant local authority, Fingal County Council in the case of Dublin Airport, or on board Planona as appropriate. Two of the conditions relating to noise operating restrictions are of particular concern to DAA, in that they would result, they say, in operations across the entire airport being restricted during the night, between 11 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock in the morning, to limit noise impacts on the surrounding area. The constraints are such that flights at the airport in the peak hour between 6 and 7 o'clock would actually have to be cut back by about a third. Over the last number of months, DAA has been examining the scope of a further EIS for the purpose of seeking a review of the operating restrictions foreseen for Dublin Airport under the existing planning permission for the North Runway. I understand that a public consultation has now commenced to explain why changes are being sought to the two planning conditions and to provide an opportunity for stakeholders to contribute to the content of and approach to be adopted in the EIS process. Regarding the issue of noise, EU Regulation 598/14 relating to the introduction of noise-related operating restrictions at EU airports entered into force last month. This regulation sets out the process to be followed when deciding on noise-related operating restrictions and involves consideration of all potential aircraft noise mitigation measures. The regulation provides for consultation with interested parties, including local residents living in the vicinity of the airport. The new noise regulation presents an opportunity to establish a modern, cohesive and measured approach to the management of noise at Irish airports, which is capable of delivering the best outcome for all stakeholders. With a view to ensuring the most effective implementation of the new noise regulation in Ireland, my department is currently working on the detailed technical arrangements to be set down in regulations that I intend to make in this regard as soon as possible. Finally, I met with senior officials of DAA last week to discuss a number of issues, one of which was the North Runway project. DAA advised that they are very conscious of balancing the national needs in delivering an essential piece of infrastructure while minimising impacts on local communities. In this regard, they briefed me on their engagement with residents on the project and outlined the various strands of work underway on the project, which include the discharging of pre-commencement planning conditions relating to noise mitigation measures, such as the voluntary insulation and house buyout scheme, which will be available to residents whose prices are most impacted. In addition, they spoke about the substantial public consultation and communications programme they have commenced, which will continue as the North Runway project develops. I'm just finishing. I understand that these information sessions will provide relevant and accessible information to stakeholders about the planning permission that has been granted, what will be built, when it will be built, how it will be built, and how any issues will be addressed. Okay.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Brune, 1 minute for your supplementary, and Deputy Daly, 1 minute for her supplementary.
Thanks very much. Well, Minister, I think you referred to Regulation 598/14 and some new legislation we're bringing in. You said detailed technology arrangements and so on. Does the government intend, though, to introduce a general noise bill? The concern is, and we mentioned that at the DAA briefing, they talked about, obviously, residents talk about, 69 decibel levels and and so on, and the airport referred to just average levels. Secondly, about night flights, I mean, many of the biggest airports, Heathrow, Zurich, Frankfurt, have very severe restrictions on flights between 11:30 p.m. and 4:30 a.m. Current Heathrow is restricted, I think, to 16 a night. DAA literature talks about 65 night flights, but in the Roganstown consultation, they mentioned 100 flights a night, and we'll now have the second. So, what will the department's attitude be on that? And just thirdly, could I ask you about the Indicon report? You got the Indicon report, I think, last week. It's talking about competing terminals. It also talks about a possible second airport for Dublin. I mean, what's your attitude to those? Minister's grave concern, I think, from the most affected residents, those within and close to the noise contours, and obviously we'll be expecting a very strong response from you.
Deputy Daly.
Yeah, I think in fairness, Minister, when we did raise this at Minister's questions, you were very forthright in terms of your support for residents in the area, the need for them to be adequately compensated, and those points were registered by the local communities and welcomed. I think your answer is very explicit as to the intentions of the DAA. They intend openly to breach this restrictive night flight condition. And to try and do that, even though 10 years ago, when standards were less, it was deemed to be not acceptable for the local communities. And we want to say here it is still, and even more so, not acceptable now. And the reality is that there's no business or connectivity imperative behind that proposition of that early morning glut. It is simply in place to enhance the profitability of the carriers, particularly the ones who want to have an aircraft return to base and go back out on another leg. So you have early morning flights departing to sun destinations where actually the passengers would far prefer to go mid-morning, for example. So that morning glut is all about aircraft going out and coming back in time for a second leg. And we want to say strongly that the profits of airlines is of a lesser concern to the well-being of the local community, and it's unacceptable that those conditions will be breached, that we wouldn't have a cost-benefit impact from this proposal, which hasn't been done. It needs to be done holistically, and I hope you take those points into account.
Yes, I'd like to thank the deputies again for bringing this to my attention. I don't think you'll find a more sympathetic audience or minister to the problems of the residents than I would be in this. I'm particularly conscious of the difficulties that they have, although I must say that the number of complaints landing on my desk is not as many as I would have expected. But that's probably because they're complaining to you rather than complaining to me. But I have been conscious of this for some time, and I'm quite happy that you yourselves are obviously delivering that message to me, and I'll keep in communication with you. The issue of compensation, which was raised by Deputy Daly there, when I met the DAA, Kevin Toland and Porrick O'Riordan, the chairman, last week, I asked them what sort of measures they had in mind, and they addressed the issue of insulation, which I didn't think was necessarily the be-all and end-all, but they did talk in terms of paying people premium prices for their houses. Now, I didn't, if they were disturbed or if they had to move, but I understood that. By that, I understand that it's not just the market price they're talking about, and I would take some sort of encouragement from that. We weren't specific on it, but I will continue to pursue them on that particular issue if people do feel that the noise is so great that they have to move. And I think in certain circumstances that is a disturbance which is not warranted, and nobody actually deserves. Their unfortunate victims of what is obviously a necessary development in the infrastructure of the country. On the issue of the, I take fully your point about it being about the conditions having been, some of the conditions having been set for noise many years ago, and I think that will be something they bear in mind, and particularly in the public consultation process. On the issue of the Indicon report and competing terminals, which was raised by Deputy Brun, I'm just reading the Indicon report at the moment, and obviously that's something which will have to be considered. Will have to be considered in the light of developments at the airport. I've got an open mind about that, and I'll be discussing it with various parties in the near future.
Thank you, Minister. We move on to question 3 by